December 21st, 1945. The phone rang in Dwight D. Eisenhower's office in Washington, D.C., cutting through the quiet routine of a post-war morning. When the call ended, Eisenhower remained still for a long moment, the receiver resting in his hand. George S. Patton was dead. For 3 years of war, Eisenhower had walked a narrow, exhausting tightrope. In public, he disciplined his most controversial general. In private, he depended on him more than almost anyone else. He defended Patton to politicians, apologized for him to allies, restrained him when his words and actions threatened diplomatic catastrophe, and unleashed him when the situation on the battlefield demanded something no ordinary commander could deliver. Now Patton was gone. And for the first time since the war began, Eisenhower no longer had to measure every word. In the weeks and months that followed, what he said behind closed doors revealed a truth he had buried under layers of political necessity. Patton was not just a good general. He was irreplaceable. Losing him felt, in a strange way, like losing the most effective weapon the Allies had ever possessed. Long before there was a supreme Allied commander and his most feared subordinate, there were simply two young officers who understood each other almost instinctively. In 1919, at Camp Meade, Eisenhower and Patton were both captains in the newly formed Tank Corps. The First World War had ended, but the future of warfare was still being argued in dusty offices and muddy training grounds. The two men spent long hours together, tearing down engines, sketching diagrams, and debating tactics late into the night. They imagined armies that moved faster than any before, striking deep, bypassing strong points, breaking the enemy through speed and shock rather than slow attrition. Patton was the aristocrat, born into wealth, carrying himself with supreme confidence, already a combat veteran of Mexico and France. Eisenhower was the Kansas farm boy who had missed combat in World War I and still felt the weight of something unproven hanging over him. Yet they connected immediately, bound by a shared vision. Tanks, they believed, were not merely infantry support. They were the future itself. The Army disagreed. Traditionalists shut down their ideas, dismissed their theories, and warned them that pushing too hard could ruin their careers. Patton, backed by family wealth and a sense of destiny, could afford to be defiant. Eisenhower, who depended on his paycheck and his prospects, learned an early lesson in restraint. He learned how to argue carefully, how to compromise, how to survive within a system that resisted change. 23 years later, those two captains stood at the very center of the largest war in human history. One had become the supreme Allied commander in Europe. The other had become the most feared general in the American Army. The friendship remained, but everything else had changed. Now Eisenhower had to manage Patton. He had to harness his aggression, explain his controversies to Roosevelt and Churchill, justify him to George Marshall, and constantly decide when to unleash him and when to hold him back. Patton resented this deeply. He believed Eisenhower had become too political, too cautious, too focused on diplomacy and coalition management. Patton wanted to fight wars, not manage alliances. The tension between them simmered throughout the conflict. Two men who had once been equals were now locked in a relationship where one had the authority to command, and the other had the raw power to change the course of battles. In August 1943, that tension exploded into public view in Sicily. Patton, commanding the 7th Army, visited field hospitals and encountered soldiers suffering from what was then called combat fatigue or shell shock. To Patton, raised on a harsh code of discipline and endurance, these men looked like cowards. In two separate incidents, he slapped soldiers, called them disgraceful, and threatened violence. Word spread quickly. Journalists heard about it. Politicians demanded answers. The public reacted with outrage. Eisenhower suddenly faced one of the hardest decisions of his career. Fire Patton and lose the most aggressive battlefield commander he had, or protect him and risk a political firestorm that could undermine Allied unity. Eisenhower chose a careful middle path. He issued a formal reprimand and ordered Patton to apologize, not just privately but publicly, to the soldiers, the medical staff, and his entire command. It was humiliating, and it was meant to be. But Eisenhower stopped short of ending Patton's career. The reason was simple. Eisenhower was already planning the invasion of France, and he knew, deep down, that he needed Patton. Not wanted. Needed. In Sicily, Patton had proven what Eisenhower had long suspected. He moved faster than anyone else. He hit harder. He left the enemy confused, demoralized, and constantly off balance. While British forces advanced methodically, Patton's army raced across the island, rewriting expectations of what modern armies could do. Saving Patton came at a price. Eisenhower had to defend the decision to Marshall, to Roosevelt, to the War Department. He had to promise that Patton would be controlled, that such incidents would never happen again, that the military value outweighed the political damage. What Eisenhower could never say publicly was that he wasn't entirely sure Patton's instincts were wrong. In private conversations, Eisenhower admitted frustration with soldiers who broke under pressure. He did not condone Patton's actions, but he understood the mindset. War demanded endurance. Patton's method was brutal and unacceptable, but his belief in discipline and mental toughness was not entirely misplaced. Eisenhower buried those thoughts, reprimanded Patton in public, and protected him in private. As D-Day approached in the spring of 1944, Eisenhower faced another problem. The Allies needed to convince the Germans that the invasion would come at Calais, not Normandy. The solution was Operation Fortitude, one of the most elaborate deceptions in military history. At the center of it all stood George Patton. German intelligence believed Patton was the most dangerous Allied commander. They had studied his campaigns and tracked his movements obsessively. Eisenhower exploited that obsession. Patton was placed in command of a fictitious First Army Group. He inspected fake units, gave speeches, and posed at dummy bases. Inflatable tanks and plywood landing craft filled fields and ports. German reconnaissance reported it all, and Berlin believed every word. It worked perfectly. German divisions remained tied down at Calais even after the Normandy landings began. Allied soldiers lived because of it. Patton, however, was furious. He wanted to be in the first wave, not playing actor for a phantom army. He felt humiliated, sidelined while others earned glory. Eisenhower could not tell him the full truth. He could not explain that Patton's reputation was, at that moment, more valuable than his command. Only after the war did Patton fully understand the scale of what he had been used for, and even then, resentment lingered. Eisenhower had used Patton's greatest weapon not on the battlefield, but in the minds of the enemy. On August 1, 1944, Patton's Third Army finally became operational in France. What followed stunned everyone. In a single month, the Third Army advanced farther than any comparable force in history. French towns fell in rapid succession. German units collapsed or surrendered in droves. The speed was relentless. Eisenhower watched with pride and growing anxiety. Patton was proving everything they had once dreamed of back in 1919. But he was also outrunning his supply lines and straining coordination with other Allied armies. Bradley was careful and methodical. Montgomery was slower still, refusing to move until everything was perfect. Patton simply moved. He called Eisenhower's headquarters constantly, demanding fuel and ammunition. "Give me the supplies," he said, "and I'll be in Berlin in 2 weeks." Eisenhower knew it was not that simple. Supplies had to be shared. Allies had to be considered. Agreements with the Soviets mattered. Patton did not care. He saw the enemy collapsing and believed every delay wasted precious time. Privately, Eisenhower sometimes agreed. In conversations with his chief of staff, he admitted that Patton might be right, that caution and politics were interfering with military logic. But as Supreme Commander, Eisenhower could not think only of the next battle. He had to think of the alliance, the peace to come, and the balance of power afterward. Then, in December 1944, disaster struck. The Germans launched a massive surprise attack through the Ardennes. American lines buckled. Units were surrounded. Panic spread. Eisenhower gathered his commanders at Verdun. The atmosphere was grim. Defensive plans dominated the discussion. Then Eisenhower turned to Patton and asked a simple question. How long will it take you to attack? Patton had already anticipated the moment. He had planned for it in advance. He opened his notebook and calmly replied, 3 divisions, 72 hours. The room fell silent. Eisenhower knew what that meant, and he trusted Patton completely. Make it so, he said. Patton delivered. On December 22nd, exactly as promised, the Third Army slammed into the German flank, turning potential disaster into victory. In that moment, every compromise, every apology, every restraint paid off. When everything was falling apart, Eisenhower turned to Patton, and Patton did what no one else could. After the war, Patton became a liability almost overnight. His comments, his instincts, his obsession with future conflict were unacceptable in peacetime. Eisenhower removed him from command. Their final conversations were bitter. Patton felt betrayed. Eisenhower felt trapped. Then came the accident, and then Patton was gone. Only then did Eisenhower allow himself to speak freely. In private letters and conversations, he admitted what he had never said aloud. Patton achieved results through speed, pressure, and sheer force of will. Traits that could not be taught or replaced. Managing Patton had been the hardest part of his command, and the most important. In his memoirs, Eisenhower used a word that carried enormous weight. Indispensable. Eisenhower would go on to become president, guiding America through the Cold War. But he never forgot Patton. He never forgot the burden of command, the loneliness of restraining someone you need, or the cost of balancing what is militarily effective with what is politically acceptable. America lost more than a general in December 1945. It lost a man built for chaos, for speed, for the moments when everything is falling apart. Eisenhower had always known it. Only after Patton was gone could he finally say it.